Well, I guess we are online, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to you who are here. It's been, week by week seems to just go by. So I was talking to a few people today, and I'm like, we're already in August. I have no idea how that happened. So, as we get started tonight, we're going to go to the Lord in prayer. I know for some people, some comments have been made, and just so everybody knows, it's not that we're being insensitive to prayer concerns or so on here in the church. However, for people's privacy, we're not saying names and so on that are out there, for everyone else to hear. But we do know that we have families in our church grieving losses and so on, so we want to keep them in prayer. So before we get started, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, we come to you with grateful hearts for just all that you do for us. Lord, there is so much sadness and so much strife and just discord going on, and yet you are such a good God, and we have so much to be grateful for, and may we not forget your blessings upon us each day. I thank you, Lord, for the very much needed rain that we've gotten over the last few days. We've been so hot and so dry, and I know that we don't always like those gloomy days, but we need the rain as well, and we thank you for that. And I know I've talked to many farmers who are very thankful and grateful for that also, because they've seen just a turnaround in their crops. And Lord, sometimes we get caught up in our daily routines and don't view the bigger picture. And I thank you that you're a God who's over all those things that maybe we don't even think about, and that you care. I pray, Lord, for those families who are hurting and grieving right now, Lord. I pray that you would be with them, be their God, be their comfort, be their peace through these times. Speak to them and minister to them. I pray that you would be here in our midst tonight, Lord, and that we would see the hard truths there are in your word. Lord, this has not been an easy passage, and as I look at this and try to grasp and understand why, it also makes me realize how much of that we're doing in our nation and in our churches today, trying to grasp and understand why. And yet, Lord, we know who the prince and the power of this earth is, and the evil that he is out to deal. And I just pray, Lord, that you would help us to learn from this tonight, help us to grow from this and change. I thank you for your word, and thank you for the preservation of it, and pray again that you would just be here tonight. In your holy and precious name, amen. Okay, so we talked last week about the fall and the death of Saul and his sons. And so, of course we know that God chose David as the next king of Israel to succeed after Saul. And yet we know that that wasn't something that was just going to come about easily. And, I know depending on the version, depending on which, Bible or, whatever you may have, but all the Bibles like to put little headings over different chapters and so on. And it depends, they vary from, Bible to Bible, not that there's anything wrong with that. But when I looked at the one chapter we're going to kind of look at tonight, the particular Bible that I use chose to put the term civil war at the top of the heading for chapter 3 of 2 Samuel. And I just thought, wow, this is so sad when people of the same race, the same nation, the same, whatever, they decide to go up and battle each other. And as we look at this tonight, we're going to see that no good ever comes from that. It just brings, destruction and sadness and grief. And, it also kind of hit me, one, where we are culturally in this world, where we seem in the United States so divided over so many things, and two completely different sides. And sometimes you think, do we live in the same country? How can we see things so differently? And then the other thing it made me think of is when these divisions rise up among believers, and we sit and we battle out things, and yet do we serve the same God? These battles should not exist. And so we're going to kind of sadly see, and this just, honestly, this whole passage just broke my heart, because you see the evil intents of man, you see jealousies, you see power struggles, and all of those things are still at play today. And sadly, are even at play among believers, and it just shouldn't be. It should not exist. And so I think with a heavy heart, for me personally, we're going to begin to look in 2 Samuel chapter 2. And there is not necessarily a particular psalm that's written specifically in accordance with this, but we are going to look at a little bit in the Psalms as we see and look at David's heart. And we're going to kind of go back and forth there as we go. I have those marked. But this begins after the death of Saul. And it says in chapter 2 at the very beginning, sometime later, meaning this wasn't immediate, this wasn't right after Saul died, David jumped to action, okay? But some time had passed. And it said sometime later, David inquired of the Lord. So there it is. We just started off, why do I pause there? Because there is so much importance behind the action of David here, that before he acted, before he did anything, he talked to God about it. And he asked the Lord, should I go to one of the towns of Judah? So remember, he's still back in Ziklag, which was currently being held by the Philistines. And he's received news of the death of Saul there. And after some time has gone by, he's gone to the Lord and he's said, okay, should I go back to my homeland? Now, we know David is of the tribe of Judah, and we're going to get into that here in a little bit, that Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, okay? So they were not of the same tribe. But David is right now asking, should I go back to Judah? Should I go back to some part of Judah? And David doesn't act without asking God, and David doesn't act without getting a response from God. I think sometimes we as Christians can be swift to ask and then just jump ahead because we feel like, well, I don't know why God's waiting to answer me. So we just jump into action. But David waited for God's response. And the Lord answered him, go. So then David asked, where should I go? Now see, go wasn't good enough. David wanted specifics here. To where? Where do you want me to head, Lord? And the Lord responded, to Hebron. Now, before we go any further and think about this any further, I'm just going to jump over real quick into the book of Psalms, and I'm looking at Psalms 25. And in Psalms 25, this whole chapter kind of depicts how David was so dependent on the Lord for everything he did. And that was David's heart. He rested everything he did on the Lord. And in verse 4 of chapter 25, David says, make your ways known to me, Lord. Teach me your paths. Guide me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. I wait for you all day long. David had a heart that was bent towards waiting on the Lord, looking to the Lord for direction, looking to the Lord for where he should go. He says in verse 9 of that same chapter, he leads the humble in what is right, and he teaches them his way. All the Lord's ways show faithful love and truth to those who keep his covenant and his decrees. David's heart was one that he said, I know that as long as I remain humble, the Lord will teach me, the Lord will guide me, the Lord will direct me. I just need to wait on the Lord. And that was the heart of David, as now he's saying, okay, I haven't jumped. I've waited. Lord, is it time? Is it time for me to go home? Is it time for me to go to some point of Judah? And the Lord says, yes. And he says, where? And he says, go to Hebron. Now, at the time, Hebron was kind of considered the capital city. It would have been like in the center of Judah. Hebron would have been in the center. Now, later we know that Jerusalem kind of became that capital city. And it wasn't Hebron. But at this time, Hebron was kind of like the capital city, the main hub of the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Judah was one of the biggest tribes. So it says in verse 2, all that, we're in verse 1. So it says in verse 2, so David went there. And it goes on to explain he went there with the different wives, and it gives the name of each one of them. And then it says, in addition, David brought the men who were with him, each one with his family, and they settled in the towns near Hebron. So we know that David didn't just go by himself. He took everyone that was with him. So this was no small little gathering. This wasn't David and his wife journeyed with their child. No. This was a large group of people. So they were going to be noticed. So it was probably a pretty good idea that David said, okay, Lord, is this a good idea for me to go home yet? So here they are, And it says when they arrived, in verse 4, that the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So the instant response when David arrives in Hebron is that the men of Judah come and they instantly anoint David as king. See, word had spread throughout all of the land. They all knew that David was God's choice as next king. This was pretty common knowledge. Even to Saul himself, this was common knowledge. But you notice that the men of Judah came and they anointed David king over the house of Judah. They did not make a claim to make him the king over all of Israel, okay? This was over Judah, the house of Judah. They made no other claims, just that they were going to recognize him as their king. So when we see this happen, instantly, God's people are divided, okay? That's what instantly happened here, because the tribe of Judah was not in any way, shape, or form going to speak for all of the people or try to rally all the people together. It was, we are going to make you our king. So they told David it was the men of Jabesh-Gilead who buried Saul. So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh-Gilead and said to them, "The Lord bless you, because you have shown this kindness to Saul your Lord when you buried him. Now may the Lord show kindness and faithfulness to you, and I will also show the same goodness to you, because you have done this deed. Therefore be strong and valiant, for though Saul your Lord is dead, the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." Now here in these couple of verses, we're reminded of the fact that when Saul's body was taken and put on display by the Philistines, these men traveled a long journey and came and kind of snuck his body away, and then because they couldn't go to a proper burial, they burned the body, and then later, took the ashes. They had done something that was honorable. And David, we see maybe his first act of leadership as now the king over Judah, is to show that his utter respect for Saul, and to not only show that he still respected Saul, but to then greatly show favor towards these men who had done such great honor to Saul. So we start to quickly see, we've seen what kind of a leader David is outside with his band of men. But now we see him made king over this part of Judah. And we see his first act of leadership is showing respect to Saul, and then also showing his gratitude to these men, and then saying, "Listen, I promise you I will be a good king over you as well." And he shows them favor. So we begin to see the heart of David as a leader. But then the story shifts, because remember I said it's now a nation divided. It's now God's people divided, because this part's recognizing David as their king. But we're going to hear what happens with the other side. So in verse 8, it says, "Abner, son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Saul's son Ishbosheth and moved him to Mahanaim, whatever. He made him king over Gilead, Asher, Jezreel, Ephraim, and Benjamin, over all of Israel." So here we have Abner, who was the commander of Saul's army. Abner was Saul's first cousin, very close relation to Saul. And he has decided, okay, Saul's gone, but Ishbosheth, who, by the way, wasn't out to war with the rest of his brothers, I'm going to make Ishbosheth king, or I'm going to set him up. So you see who's running the show here. This is Abner, okay? And Abner has this plan, and he's going to honor Saul, and he is going to make Ishbosheth king over all these other tribes who are settled over here in Israel. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, we're going to see the depth of the problem of this later. But here we can see that, okay, for starters, he's just deeming who's going to be king and making Ishbosheth that. But we know that Jonathan was in line to be king. And so if anyone was in line, it would have been Jonathan's son Mephibosheth. Now, at that time, that wasn't really possible, because at the death of Jonathan, Mephibosheth was probably about 5 years old, which we'll kind of catch up with that story here later on, because Mephibosheth was hidden away because he was a child and probably feared he would be sought after to kill him too, because he was next in line as king. So Abner is way out of line here with who he's choosing and who he's forcing into this role. But he makes Ishbosheth king. And it says Saul's son Ishbosheth was 40 years old when he became king over Israel. And it says he reigned for 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. And the length of time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Now we see there's a bit of a time lapse there because it's saying 7.5 years David was over Judah, but Ishbosheth was only over Israel for 2. Now, they kind of disagree on this, and the best I can come up with is that it was probably 2 years of relative peace, that David kind of stuck to his territory over here, and Ishbosheth was over here, and they kind of kept things pretty calm. And then that calmness ended. Now, Ishbosheth was probably king longer than that, but not peacefully, and not with very much control. Because we're going to see that Abner, that cousin of his dad's, was pretty much running the show and how things went. Ishbosheth was never meant to be king. God was never going to bless this. Ishbosheth was not a leader. This was not his role, okay? But it kind of gives us that timeline. And then it moves on about Abner. It says, Abner, son of Ner, and soldiers of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, marched out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. So Joab, son of Uriah, and David's soldiers marched out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. So to lay out the scene here, lay out kind of what's about to go on, Abner decides, okay, it's time for us to kind of face off with our brothers, if you would say. So he takes his soldiers, from Saul's armies, and off he goes, okay? And he's going to go down to this land that's kind of in the middle between where Hebron was. And Hebron, if you figure, is kind of down here on the map, and then you go way up here on the map, and here's Israel. And so Gibeon was kind of in the middle of that. So they're going to travel down here to kind of face off and kind of see where they're at. So then we pick up in verse 13, and it says, Joab, son of Uriah. Well, who's he? Well, Uriah was David's sister. So Joab was David's nephew, very trusted and favored among David's men, okay? And so he's leading one of David's armies. So he takes soldiers, David's soldiers, and he marches out to the pool of Gibeon to kind of come face to face with Abner. So it says the two groups took up position on opposite sides of the pool. So here they are at this pool of Gibeon, and you can just kind of imagine what this is like. They're all of the same people. They used to all fight in battles together, and suddenly here they are divided. I imagine that David probably said, I hear they're coming. Go see what's going on. Maybe he sent Joab down there and he said, listen, I just want you to go down and see what is happening, what Abner wants, what's going on. So here they are, and they're kind of both positioned on this side like, okay, if you're going to fight, we're going to fight. And there's kind of this face-off going on. And then what I'm going to read, I'm telling you, I cannot even guess how many commentaries I read. And no one can make sense. They talk complete gibberish. I was beyond frustrated, and I sat there and I thought, what just happened here? I mean, I'm telling you, we're going to read this, and what were they doing? What happened here was so wrong on so many levels. And I think that, when you've got the term, it confounds the wise. This makes no sense to even the wisest of the wise, what takes place here. So Abner says to Joab, verse 14, let's have the young men get up and compete in front of us. What? Let's pick some guys and let's have them, I don't know, battle off, face off, maybe show what they're good at. So Abner comes up with this crazy, almost a challenge. So let them get up, Joab replied. Joab, I'm thinking we've got a couple of hothead leaders here. What is happening? It says, so they got up and were counted off. 12 for Benjamin. So now there were other tribes involved in this army with Abner, but specifically Abner chooses 12 from the tribe of Benjamin to stand up like almost in defense against David's armies for Saul. Okay, like in reverence of Saul and for the tribe of Benjamin, this is who Abner picks, 12 from the tribe of Benjamin. For Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 from David's soldiers. So then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side so that they all died together. So this place, which is in Gibeon, is named Field of Blades. So 12 men from this side and 12 men from this side face off with each other and in essence kill each other. For what purpose, for what reason? They will debate. Some believe that David's men killed the 12 Benjamites and then went after them all, and that they didn't all 24 die. Most agree that all 24 died. But the senselessness of this, and it just tells me that, you know what? This was never meant to be divided, but these were power struggles by man that were going against God's plan. And so senselessness was what was going to happen. And it was just wrong. So now this place is called the Field of Blades. And as you can imagine, once all these men start fighting and there's this scene, now there's rage, and it has started a full-blown battle between the two sides. And this was just something that David probably sent his men, like I said, down to say, what are they doing? Why are they coming up here? What do they want? And now, thanks to Abner's little challenge, full-blown war has broken out. So it says the battle that day was extremely fierce. And Abner and the men of Israel were defeated by David's soldiers. And the 3 sons of Uriah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Asahel was a fast runner, it says, like one of the wild gazelles. So it's telling us here in verse 18 that one of these 3 boys, which would have been nephews of David, the one was just a fast runner. He was trained. The speed was his thing. And so now here we are in the midst of the battle. These 3 men are named. And it says that this one, the fast one, he chased Abner. And he did not turn to the right or to the left in his pursuit of him. So he wasn't giving up. He had no distractions. Nothing could stop him. He was headed for the big guy. He wanted that one. He was going to take him out. And he was in hot pursuit. So it says that Abner glanced back and said, "Is that you, Asahel?" And "Yes, it is," he replied. Abner said to him, "Turn to your right or left. Seize one of the young soldiers and take whatever you can get from him." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. So what Abner was telling him was listen, I know what you want. You want to kill me and you want my armor as a trophy to take back to David. Why don't you look somewhere else? Take somebody else's armor back as a trophy. But he couldn't be persuaded to stop chasing him. So he says, once again, Abner warned Asahel, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How could I ever look your brother Joab in the face?" There was enough sense to Abner here, although he had challenged this army, that, listen, I don't really want to have to deal with your brother. Like, don't push me into a corner. I don't want to kill you. He's warning him, like, stop chasing me, stop pursuing me, turn around. We don't want this to go this direction because it isn't going to be good when I have to come face to face with your brother. So it says in verse 23, but Asahel refused to turn away. So Abner hit him in the stomach with the butt of his spear. And the spear went through his body, and he fell and died right there. As they all came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died, they stopped. But it says, Joab and Abishai pursued Abner. By sunset, they had gone as far as the hill of Amal, which is opposite Giah on the way to the wilderness of Gibeon. So now the brothers are angry. They've come upon this scene. Now their brother's dead. And in their anger, they are continuing to pursue Abner all the way through. And now darkness is coming. And it says the Benjamites rallied to Abner. They formed a unit and they took their stand on top of a hill. So now Abner has more forces. This battle has raged on down there. Abner has fled. Understand this. Abner's running away. Abner's retreating. But this one wouldn't leave him alone. It was like he was the trophy. He was the one to catch. And Abner tried to persuade him, listen, go somewhere else. But now the brothers are seeking Abner. But the Benjamites have rallied together and they've formed basically a wall of protection. It says in verse 26 that Abner called out to Joab. He said, must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize this will only end in bitterness? How long before you tell the troops to stop pursuing their brothers? So suddenly Abner is now challenging Joab back. Like, listen, are you going to do this all night? You're going to chase your brothers? I mean, we're family. Why are you doing this? Why are you chasing us? Like, how long are you going to keep this up? But he says something very wise in the midst of this. He says, don't you realize this will only end in bitterness? There was so much truth to that because the war that had broken out here wasn't going to ultimately make anyone happy. It wasn't going to fulfill anything for anyone. It was solving absolutely nothing. Nothing. And it was only going to take them down a path of regret and things they just, a path they didn't want to go down. And such a warning to us over some of the things that we decide to get so angry about, and we're going to stand up and we're going to fight, and it just leads to a path of regret. And I fear the regrets our nation may face over some of the fights that are currently happening. I fear that we're going to have regrets in our churches as we battle amongst each other. It's sad when these things exist and nobody is putting the Lord first. Now understand, David's out of this scene. We saw David's heart was bent towards, Lord, lead me, Lord, direct me, Lord, whatever way you would have me go in. But that was not the case for these other men. And here they are. And so when I said, don't read the part, don't you realize this will only end in bitterness? Abner knew what this was going to cause. But in verse 27, Joab replied, as God lives, if you had not spoken up, the troops wouldn't have stopped pursuing their brothers until morning. He's like, listen, you challenged us. Remember that? Remember, you're the one who started this whole mess, Abner. And now suddenly you've got some sense and you want this to stop? I mean, Joab's sitting there going, it was your idea to have 12 and 12 and fight against each other, and this whole war broke out. That fault lies to you, Abner. But had you not stopped and said this now, who knows when this would have ended. So it says that Joab blew the ram's horn, and all the troops stopped. They no longer pursued Israel or continued to fight. So Abner and his men marched through the Arabah all the night. They crossed the Jordan, they marched all morning, and arrived back at Mahanaim. And it says, when Joab had turned back after pursuing Abner, he gathered all the troops. In addition to Asahel, 19 of David's soldiers were missing. So 19 of David's soldiers fell that day, including Asahel. But they had killed 360 of the Benjamites. That was a great loss. There was a reason why Abner was running and retreating. Abner saw the way that battle was going, and he knew he needed to get out of there. And so it says, afterward, they carried Asahel to his father's tomb in Bethlehem and buried him. And Joab and his men marched all night and reached Hebron at dawn. This battle went badly. And so there were many who had all these feelings like what is about to come was Abner's fault and it was justice and it was whatever. But you know what? There were two sides who had equally gone to battle here. Two sides who had agreed. maybe Abner sparked that little argument, but Joab was quick to follow and say, sure, let's do this, and pick 12 of his own men for this nonsense. Just absolute ridiculousness to throw these 12 and 12 up against each other and say, hey, fight it out. Show who's better. And this was slaughter that day. 360 Benjamites died that day. Can't imagine for a second this brought any joy to David. But sadly, this is where it was when man was at play instead of God. You would have thought they were fighting their enemy, the Philistines, not each other. They had lost sight of who their real enemy was. It was not each other. And sometimes we get so caught up in our strife and our arguments that we lose sight of who the real enemy is. And it's not each other. And ultimately, for the Christian, our enemy is Satan. That roaring lion who wants to devour all that he can. And we lose sight of who the real enemy is, and we pick earthly enemies to have, and we have earthly battles, and we forget we're in a spiritual battle going on. And we fall prey to it, and we get caught in the same traps. So I wish I could say that's where the story ends. That's where chapter 2 ends. But chapter 3 tells us, and this is the chapter that was labeled Civil War. This was an ugly thing that was going on between the people of God. And it says, during the long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, David was growing stronger, and the house of Saul was becoming weaker. It was sadly, Abner was still defending Saul, was still defending Saul's house. We don't see much word of Ishbosheth in there. It was just what Abner was doing, trying to hold some control and some order for Saul, but it wasn't working. So for the sake of time, I won't go down through the names, but it begins to lay out. Time is passing. It begins to label all the sons that were being born to David and the family that David was building, the wives David had. And it says, these were born to David in Hebron. But then in verse 6 of chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, it says, during the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner kept acquiring more power in the house of Saul. Now, what does that mean? He kept acquiring more power. Well, again, Ishbosheth was not much of a king. He was just a son of Saul that it was like, hey, yeah, you be king. All your brothers are dead. You be king. Abner kind of needed somebody to step up and take this position. He kind of forced Ishbosheth in there, but we see ultimately Abner was the one in charge. Abner was kind of the one running the show. He was the one doing everything, and he was gaining power. People looked to Abner instead of to Ishbosheth. People looked to the head of military instead of to the king. And that's what was happening here. So it says that this was happening, and in verse 7, it says, now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth questioned Abner, why did you sleep with my father's concubine? Now, this would have been something that someone would have done, taking honor away from the family. But it doesn't really say that Abner ever did this. It was just that as he was gaining power and all the people were looking to Abner for leadership, Ishbosheth started kind of resenting this and started getting cynical, and he throws this question out and accuses, Abner of taking one of his father's concubines. So Abner gets very angry over at this in verse 8. And he says he was very angry about Ishbosheth's accusation. And he says, am I a dog's head? Meaning, do I have no honor? Am I a dog's head who belongs to Judah? He asked. Listen, all this time I've been loyal to the family of your father Saul, to his brothers, to his friends. He's like, who have I been serving here, Ishbosheth? I've been serving you. I've been serving your dad, your brothers, your friends. I have done nothing but honor you. And you accuse me of something like this? It's what he says next that begins to get interesting. He says, I haven't betrayed you to David. I haven't handed you over to him. I haven't given you to him. But now you accuse me of wrongdoing with this woman? That's what I get paid back? For all the loyalty I've shown you? Ooh, Then he proceeds with, may God punish Abner and do so severely if I don't do for David what the Lord swore to him. What? Suddenly now Abner is looking right in Ishbosheth's face and he's saying, listen, may God punish me if I don't do for David what the Lord swore to David. This is giving us indication that Abner was completely aware of the fact that David was to be the next king of Israel. But Abner took matters into his own hands and out of loyalty to Saul, placed Ishbosheth in that position. But now he's saying, listen, if I don't do for David what the Lord swore to him, and in verse 10, he clarifies what that is, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and establish the throne of David over Israel and Judah, from Dan to Beersheba. Well, Ishbosheth did not dare respond to Abner because he was afraid of him. He was afraid that Abner would do exactly what he said, that he would hand Israel over to David as well. And Ishbosheth was terrified of this, and he knew the power and the control that Abner had, and he knew he could do it. So he said nothing. Didn't stop Abner. Abner sent messengers as his representatives to say to David, whose land is it? Make your covenant with me, and you can be certain I am on your side to turn all of Israel over to you. Abner regretted siding with Ishbosheth. Abner regretted what he had done because now this little brat is now accusing him of something he didn't do. All this I've given to you, all this loyalty. We've lost men. I keep going out into battle against David. We know he's the one who God deemed as the next king, and now this is what you're going to do to me? This is how you're going to treat me? You're going to betray me like that? Oh, he's not happy. So instantly he sends messengers to David. And he says to David, whose land is this? Knowing full well that God had given it to David. So he says, make your covenant with me, and you can be certain I'm on your side, and all of Israel will be turned over to you. So David replied, good, I will make a covenant with you. However, there's one thing I require of you. You will not see my face unless you first bring Saul's daughter Michal when you come to see me. So we don't see David cynical. We don't see David's like, okay, that's fine. I'll make this agreement with you. I think David could really see this scene for what it was. He knew all the battles that had been going on. He knew all the lives that were being lost. He wanted this ended. But he's like, we need to make one thing right first. I want my wife Michal back. See, what had been done with her was wrong, and it was done wrong to David. She should have never been given to another man, but Saul did that. And that other man should have never taken her. He was taking another man's wife. And so David is saying, before we make a covenant, before we make an alliance, before we agree on anything, I want what was done wrong to me repaired. So it says, then David sent messengers to say to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, give me back my wife Michal. I was engaged to her for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins. He's like, listen, I paid my price for her. I did my job. She's mine. So Ishbosheth, now that not Abner, Ishbosheth, the king, he sent someone to take her away from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. It says her husband followed her weeping all the way to Bahurim, but Abner said to him, go back. Listen, you just go back, you go back home. What's done is done. She's going back over to David. We're going to make an alliance here. And we see that Ishbosheth was the one who, out of probably some fear, said, okay, fine, just give David what he wants. Ishbosheth knew that he no longer had Abner on his side, and that he better just do it. Or who knows what might fall on his home. Ishbosheth was afraid at this point. So it says that Abner conferred with the elders of Israel. In the past, you wanted David to be king over you. Now take action because the Lord has spoken concerning David. So here's Abner talking to all the leaders, all the heads of Israel. And he's reminding them the words of the Lord. He says, through my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the power of the Philistines and the power of all Israel's enemies. He reminds them, listen, God says that it's through David you'll be saved from your enemy. It's through David that the Philistines will have no power over you. He's, in essence, persuading them, listen, this is the right thing to do. You're going to be in good hands if you go over to David. You need to do this. It says Abner also informed the Benjamites, and he went to Hebron to inform David about all that was agreed on by Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. So when Abner and 20 men came to David at Hebron, David held a banquet for him and his men. Abner said to David, let me now go, and I will gather all Israel to my lord the king. They will make a covenant with you, and you will reign over all you desire. So David dismissed Abner, and he went in peace. So we see that once Abner convinced all of Israel, all the leaders of Israel, to make this alliance with David, to allow David to now reign over them all, that Abner takes 20 men and he goes there and he speaks with David. And David prepares a great feast and they all sit down. I mean, there's a banquet. I mean, an alliance is about to be made. They're going to have a covenant with each other. The people of God are going to be united. David is seeing this as a good thing. Abner at this stage has given him no reason to fear anything. And so all seems well. And now Abner's going to go back home and he's going to rally the men of Israel, and this is going to be a done deal. All is going well. But once David now dismisses Abner, and Abner goes in peace, it says, that then David's soldiers and Joab, remember his nephew Joab? They returned from a raid and brought a large amount of plundered goods with them. So they had just been out fighting probably the Philistines and had just come back from that battle and had a lot of stuff with them that they had gotten in that battle. And Abner was not with David in Hebron because David had dismissed him and he had gone in peace. When Joab and his whole army arrived, Joab was informed. Somebody told him, they said, listen, Abner, son of Ner, came to see the king. And the king dismissed him, and he went away in peace. So word got back to Joab. Now that starts to give us some indication that Joab was a pretty powerful leader of the armies and greatly respected, enough so that somebody went to him and said, hey, Abner was here. The king threw a big banquet for him. They had some great talks, and then the king had the nerve to send him away in peace. So somebody's run to Joab with this news. So it says in verse 24 that Joab went to the king and said, what have you done? Look here, Abner came to you. Why did you dismiss him? Now he's getting away. You know that Abner, son of Ner, came to deceive you and to find out about your military activities and everything you're doing. He's sitting there looking at David, you know, his uncle, and he's saying, have you lost your mind? I mean, you prepare a banquet for him? Don't you know what he's doing? He's here to deceive you. He's here to cause trouble. Now, we can see that Joab kind of led his army based on, you know, his own mind, his own thoughts, his own angers, his own whatever. And yet we see David as a leader leading under the direction of the Lord. But could Joab see that? No, not even a little bit. All he could think of was, you know what? I'm the head of this army, and Abner's the head of this army, and I cannot believe you're even talking to him. Have you lost your mind? And he's angry. Angry. So it says, Joab left David, and he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sarab, but David was unaware of it. Now understand, what that verse is telling us is that Joab sent some messengers to tell Abner the king would like you to come back. The king needs to talk to you about something. So Abner's coming back under the idea that the king has kind of sent for him again. So, you know, expecting nothing, you know, unaware of any problem, Abner goes back. So it says, David, though, completely unaware of any of this happening. And when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab pulled him aside to the middle of the city gate as if to speak to him privately. So the city gate was a very public area where matters of business were normally discussed. And at the city gates would be where the justices of the city would sit, and they would help deal with disputes and arguments among the people. So this was a very public area. And Joab kind of pulls him there. So Abner's not suspecting of anything wrong. I mean, this is a public place, and certainly he has something to discuss with me. So it says, when he pulls him aside, it was there that Joab stabbed him in the stomach. So Abner died in revenge for the death of Asahel, Joab's brother. In that moment, Joab sought revenge. Did Joab have the right to seek revenge? Well, some may say, well, of course. Abner killed his brother. Abner killed his brother in war, a war that both men had equally started. Abner had killed his brother out of self-defense. His brother would not stop pursuing him. Abner had pleaded with him, please go a different direction. Don't make me do this. And yet Asahel would not stop. So Abner had had no choice. But Joab had never gotten over this. Joab took matters into his own hands. And now here is the nation, the tribe of Judah, and the rest of Israel about to come together. And this is what the two heads of military have now fallen to. This is what Joab has done. He has sought revenge. He has sought to get even. So it says in verse 28, David heard about it later and said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May it hang over Joab's head and his father's whole family. May the house of Joab never be without someone who has a discharge or a skin disease, or a man who can only work a spindle, or someone who falls by the sword or starves. He's wishing all kinds of ill things on Joab and his family. He's saying, listen, your family is never going to be at peace. I mean, I hope that every calamity, everything that could possibly happen to you and your family falls upon your family for what you have done. Pretty harsh words spoken by the king to this man. And he says, but Joab and his brother Abishai killed Abner because he had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle of Gibeon. So now David is holding both brothers at fault for this. He said, I know you were both seeking revenge. You were both looking for your moment. And now I pray that this fall on your whole family. And David is sitting here and he is pleading his innocence. He is saying, I had nothing to do with this. David was seeking an alliance between Judah and Israel. David was seeking peace. David was seeking that God's people come back together. And yet, these other forces got in there and they divided and they separated. So it says, David ordered Joab and all the people who were with him, tear your clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourn over Abner. So he's sitting there saying, you know what, you need to realize what you've done and you need to repent of it. You need to tear your clothes, put on sackcloth, put ashes on your head. These were all signs of mourning. And you need to mourn the life you've taken. You need to feel sorry and repent over this. So it says, King David walked behind the coffin. And when they buried Abner in Hebron, the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb. And all the people wept, and the king sang a lament for Abner. He said, should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet not placed in bronze shackles. You fell like one who falls victim to criminals. And all the people wept over him even more. David's saying, listen, this man did not die a death that he should have died. Here he was innocently coming back, seeking alliance, seeking an agreement, and his life was taken from him. I mean, this was as much in honor of Abner as it was in shame for what Joab and his son and his brother had done. So it says that all the people wept over him even more, and they came to urge David to eat food while it was still day, but David took an oath. He said, may God punish me and do so severely if I taste bread or anything else before sunset. So all the people took note of this, and it pleased them. In fact, everything the king did pleased them. And on that day, all the troops and all of Israel were convinced that the king had no part in the killing of Abner, son of Ner. They knew by David's actions that he was innocent. They saw David's heart. They saw that he was a man of integrity. that he was a sincere man who truly felt sorrow over the wrong that had been done. And this is where the actions of men had just gotten carried away, and the words of men, the revenge of man, it all went badly. And the people of God suffered at the hand of each other. And it should have never, ever happened. It did not bring pleasure to God, and therefore it did not bring any pleasure to David either. This was never how David wanted to see this go. But this ends here in verses 38 and 39. It says, "The king said to his soldiers, 'You must know that a great leader has fallen in Israel today.'" He gives reverence to Abner. He said he was a great leader in Israel. We may not have agreed on everything. We may not have always been on the same side. But he was a great leader, and we need to remember that. And he says, "As for me, even though I am anointed king, I have very little power today." David's pointing out to his soldiers, listen, I don't have the power to do what I want. He said, "These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too fierce for me. So may the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil." Told you earlier, Joab had those swift to come and tell him, listen, do you know what the king's done? David was wise enough to realize the power that Joab had. He was aware of the men who, in the armies, who followed Joab as their leader, as their captain. And he said, "These men are too fierce for me. I know I can't judge them the way I would like to. I can't punish them the way I would like to. They have too much power." But a sad thing has been done here today. You know what? Sometimes there are those forces that are at play that even the top leadership have no strength to deal with them. They're too powerful. They have too much influence. They can cause a lot of harm by their sway. We see that whether it be in our governments, and I've seen that very same power play in churches, where there are certain people that have powers and controls and people following them, and they have far too much influence. And they are bent on doing evil and causing harm. And even those at the very top don't have enough power to stop them. This is a sad reminder. Here's David with a broken heart, that I'm king, and yet I still have no power here to stop this evil that's being done. And as a church, this should break our hearts. This should cause us to get on our knees and say, listen, if we've ever been guilty of any of those things, if we've ever stood up and taken part in anything that's just complete nonsense, because what happened here should have never happened. And there were many, many who died. And sadly, the story's not over, because next week we'll talk a little bit about what happened with Ishbosheth, before we get into the fact that then David becomes king over all of it, the way God intended. But see, sadly, even when God intends for something to happen, man can still have their sway, man can still have his pull, man can still destroy even what God has intended. And this is what happens when we as a people of God don't get on our knees, united, seeking the Lord. Because we see here, David was doing that, but it didn't mean that's what everyone was doing. And there were some sad, unfortunate events that took place. Any thoughts before we close? I mean, for me, this is just kind of like one of those heavy heart, sad stories. There was sadly no great resolve for this. It was unfortunate. But any thoughts? You have one? I know you're thinking. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. For those who can't hear online, it was exactly, I think, probably what gave me such a heavy heart, because it wasn't just a story. It was so real life, I think, especially for right now. And what was said here that I know you can't hear is that this is very much like what our nation is dealing with. That we're much like Israel and Judah, very divided, and not listening, just fighting. And the calamity that happened here could so easily be the fall of America if we're not careful. And whether it's politically divided, racially divided, all of these things that divide us, and there just seems to be even no attempt at realizing that, are we all Americans, regardless of color, or regardless of, any of these things. It gets ugly. And going back to, trying to think where it was, Abner's words, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize this will only end in bitterness?" No good will ever come from these fights, especially when they're just on such ugly separate sides and nobody's really listening. They're just battling it out. And it will end in bitterness. It will resolve nothing. Nothing. And it's kind of like I tell my son, you can't fix everybody else. We can't fix everybody else. All we can do is fix ourselves. And if the church as a whole, and that's why this whole COVID thing, this whole whatever, if we let all of these things immobilize the church, especially in a time in our nation where our nation isn't immobilized. I mean, there's more fighting going on than ever, regardless of the COVID. But if we as a church allow this to take us out of the equation and immobilize us, that we aren't being the body of Christ, and we aren't seeking the Lord, well then, we will have nothing to say when we become a part of everything that blows up. But as Solomon says, there's nothing new under the sun. History has a way of repeating itself. And it's when we don't learn from stories like this. If I were to take and break the Bible up into categories, this is a book of history. And that makes it very, very relevant to today, because history repeats itself. And it was not hard for me to read these chapters and see this sad end to this. And yet David's words, "I may be king, but I'm powerless right now." He couldn't stop that from happening. Couldn't stop it from happening. And in the words of Abner, "Must the sword devour forever? This will only end in bitterness." That's all that this will ever bring. So more than ever, like I tell my son, all we can do is fix us. And so it's what we do before God. And I believe that if each one of us determined to do that, it would make a big difference. Mm-hmm. 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 That's right. We do, but you're right. We do have to believe in God, and yes, as long as there are those freedoms, we will have these battles. Yes. Yes, we have. Mm-hmm. Yes, we have. But as a people of God, and as I've been preaching on Sunday mornings, we are first a citizen of heaven, not of this earth. And we need to stay focused on that there is something bigger than all of this. And we need to lean on God. So I know we've run over our time a little bit, so I appreciate you at least seeming into it. I know this one just kind of broke my heart. And those maybe watching online, throw out your comments, throw out questions. I kind of want to hear from you. Even if you're not here, I get to hear the comments here, but let me know your thoughts on this one. So anyways, it was great having you here, and let's close in a word of prayer. Lord, we come to you with heavy hearts, as we can even see similarities of this to what we're dealing with right now. And yet, God, you are still the same God today that you were then. And you see the hearts of men. And I know that the hearts you're seeing now, I'm sure, break your heart. But I pray that we would be a people of God that would be found faithful. And that we would be a people of God that would put our full trust and faith in you. And that we would act like your kids. That we would act like your children. And that we would be different. That we would rise above. That although, like David said, he in a sense felt helpless, he kept his heart bent towards you. He continued to seek direction from you. And I pray, Lord, that as a church, as a child of God, as an individual, we would seek your direction in our lives. Your direction for all that we do, all that we say. And that we would not end up praying and falling into all the same arguments that the rest of this world is in. Lord, that we would act like your child. I just pray that you would take us from this place tonight and grant us your mercies. In your holy and precious name, amen.